panelists here, and we are live. Hello and welcome to this panel on making art in the time of climate change. I want to start by inviting everybody in the audience and all our panelists to orient ourselves to this task by meditating on the challenges of depicting something like climate change and the Anthropocene in our art. So, right now, I feel there is a crisis in our literary arts of evasion where we're not talking about climate change in all the spheres and all the ways we should be, and it's only ever talked about as a problem that is solved in science fiction by technology, as if it was some speculative problem like aliens. Climate change is such a difficult topic to address in fiction. It's so amorphous. It's a combination of several catastrophes linked together with origins in our past and consequences extending into the future. As as culture makes meaning, we have to figure out new ways to make meaning from this crisis, and the depiction of climate change is more important than ever. Um, so I want to invite this panel. We have an awesome panel lined up for you to discuss these concerns. We have writers Evan Ma, Brandon Crilly, and Nico Reed, and editor and publisher Selena Middleton. I am your moderator, Sid Jain, and I will be reading comments and questions in the Toast Discord channel. I will try to keep up with this chat too, but I don't know if I can. But now I want to invite our panelists. So I would love you guys if you could introduce yourselves while talking about your favorite climate art and why it moved you. And it could be a novel, short story, painting, music, game, or whatever. And I want to start with Evan. What is your favorite climate piece of art?
Yeah, sure. I first read Purple of the Sour by Octavia Butler as a teen, and it really stuck with me ever since. And another one I've been reading recently by recommendation of former um my former visual cultures supervisor is The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Tsing. That's a really, really great one. And I'm still working through that a second reread, and I find I mean, it really shaped the way I think about climate change and also about kind of like just critical ecology as a whole. But my favorite piece of climate art is a song by late Hong Kong singer-songwriter Ellen Liu called Dancing in the Wasteland. I can drop the link to her music later on in the chat, but it's a lovely angry song about deforestation and the greed of the rich and powerful and exploitation. And so, yeah, I'll definitely put it in the chat later. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, there's so much good music about climate change that I'm also listening to. But yeah, I want to hear from all you guys. Brandon, what about you?
Hi everybody. I'm Brandon Crilly, he, him pronouns. I'm a writer here in what is often the blighted, wintry hellscape of Ottawa, Canada. Although today it's a rainy hellscape. And yeah, short fiction author and novelist and wearer of many hats. And yeah, a lot of my recent work has been climate fiction and solar punky sort of stuff as well, which kind of started my like the very first. Exposure to climate fiction that I can think of, which is still one of my favorites, is an anthology, Hieroglyph, that was edited by Ed Finn and Catherine Kramer, I think back in like 2013 or 2014 now. Well, it wasn't ostensibly just a climate fiction anthology, it was kind of a more hopeful, optimistic look at the future in general through technology and a variety of other kind of social aspects. There's a story in there about borders, and there's a story in there about indigenous land rights and so forth. And it was one of kind of the first collection of stories that I had seen that was, here, like, the world is not perfect, but here is some hope and some optimism in terms of how things can change and improve, and how people can, coexist and so forth. So that was the first one that I saw. And then more recently, When I think of climate fiction, I think of God's Monsters and the Lucky Peach by Kelly Robson, which is just this phenomenal novella that somehow manages to pair time travel and like post-apocalyptic climate fiction and bureaucracy at the same time in a way that is delightfully entertaining. So yeah, so I highly recommend that one if folks haven't checked that out.
Nice. Wow, my TBR pile is just growing from just this one question. Nico, what about you?
Yeah, hey, Nico, Ignacio Reed. I think our time zone outlier. I'm in the Philippines, so it is 10 p.m. here. Um, I, I was telling everyone I like wrote down this massive list of things that I love from climate fiction. But if I really had to choose right now, I think one of my favorite pieces is a novella by Octavia Cave called Stone Gaita. Um, that is that encompasses for me something that I love in a lot of climate fiction is the use of community and networks of people uh, in order to tackle a extraordinarily large problem, and people of diverse backgrounds, by which I mean professional backgrounds in this case, but also intersectional backgrounds individually. It's just a fantastic, fantastic book. And Octavia Cade is an incredibly skilled writer who manages to do what I was just talking about while also being incredibly personal and nuanced in the characterizations of each of the people in that book. She has another novella as well from Stelliform Press, a place you might have heard of, called The Impossible Resurrection of Grieve. It's a beautiful cover I've seen recently. And yeah, so she's just doing some of my favorite work right in that genre.
The Stone Weta is probably my answer to this question also. It's such a phenomenal book. It just shows so much that can be accomplished in the novella form with the mix of science and science fiction, and it blew my mind, really. It was great. Selena, what about you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Selena Middleton, she, her. I'm a writer as well. I usually write under the name Eileen Gunnelly, and I write a lot of climate fiction. But mostly these days I'm working as a publisher and editor for Stelliform Press. And Stelliform publishes exclusively climate fiction. So all of the titles that I'll talk a little bit about today are climate fiction. And so I'm at the moment very immersed in editing our 2022 titles. And we just finished the edits for Ray Moriz's Weird Fishes, which is like a climate underwater fantasy. It's amazing, and every time I read it, I felt like it was changing me and helping me to see things in new ways. And I really hope that it does that for other people as well. As for a book that I love that is not a Stelliform Press book, this one right here, Premi Mohammed's The Annual Migration of Clouds, really phenomenal book, and for us Canadians, a unique setting for climate fiction, I think. Alberta, a kind of a rural Alberta. And I really enjoyed the way that the book discusses colonization from a unique perspective, I thought, like with the fungus, this fungus that takes over people's will and really raises the question of how much free will do we have in this situation, which I think is a really valid question for this era that we're entering into. Yeah, so I really recommend that book.
I find it so fascinating for a topic as vast as climate change. Most of the cutting edge work is being done at the novella or short story length, and it's really funny like how much we can fit at that length of story. So my first question to you guys for the panel is something that's at kind of the heart of the title itself. So what should the aim of art be in relation to climate change? We spill so much ink on the nature of art and its meaning to the world, whether it's to generate empathy or expand the window of opportunities, possibilities, imaginations, provide solutions, or maybe just to frame the problem in a better way for everybody. But what do you believe art has a role to play in making meaning in the world, and especially when relating to climate change? And for this one, I wanted to start with Nico.
You're gonna do that. um, when Sid asked this question of us beforehand, my notes say like, Sid, this is really deep and I'm really shallow. I so my take on this question is that I shy away from saying that art should do anything in particular, um, other than exist, I suppose. But in terms of climate change, I do feel, I admit, I feel a urgency, because urgency because of the very real emergency that we are living through, and will continue to do so no matter whether we feel like writing about it or not. So within that, I personally am not a scientist, no scientific background. I read very extensively in scientific nonfiction, but I read the type that a layman can read, a layman who has read a lot of climate stuff can read. And because of that, I don't approach my own climate fiction as a educator. I don't think I'm qualified to do that. I certainly am not qualified to produce, you know, new science that will solve our problems, right? So given that I know that I'm a decent writer, and I know that that's what I put my life's work into, as a writer, as an editor, as a person in our community. So I've had to find a way to reconcile within myself holding the crisis into my life's work. Which is a lot, right? For all of us. That's heavy. But my belief, very personally, is that we have to live as if we can mitigate the harm that we are doing and that has been done. Even if you don't believe we can, we have to live as if that's possible, because we really don't have any other choice. So if the art that we do, whatever it is, can help other people live within that possibility and act as if it is possible, then I think that climate fiction has done its job. I think that's my answer. I reserve the right to think of something more clever. But yeah, that's what I've got. That's what I'm working with.
Well, I think it's perfectly right. Like we can only do the best that we feel. Like if we're not the kinds of if we're not scientists, we shouldn't be trying to provide solutions. And I think that's some place where a lot of science fiction authors try to overstep. Maybe I'm thinking Neil Stephenson's Termination Shock, where he tries to present solutions to a very complicated problem as a very simple solution, and sometimes it just doesn't work that way. So. Absolutely. Selena, what about you?
Sorry, just typing in the chat there about Stone Weta, which was not from Stellaform, but I can't quite remember who it was from. If anyone has that information, they're asking in the chat. So in terms of like whether climate fiction should be putting forth a message or a lesson, I think that I tread a line on this, because I think that is ultimately the purpose of climate fiction, to make meaning and to help shift the culture a little bit, because I think that that's where our greatest challenge is. We have the science to understand the problem. We largely have the technology to fix it, but it's not a scientific or technological problem. It's a culture problem. And I think that that's where writers and readers can come into this problem and really show our strengths. I know for me, the skills that I've honed over the years in academia and now in publishing are the kind of skills that we need to get the message out to people that, we need to change the way that we're behaving. We need to change the way that we're thinking about how we interact with the environment and what we take for granted, I think, especially in the West. So I tread a little bit of a line. I think that, yes, it is important for that message to be in the work, but I don't think that it should necessarily be obvious. I think that it needs to get under the skin of the reader in an emotional way, use emotion to get that message across. And this is one of the reasons why Stelliform is focusing on character rather than technology. So a lot of the books that we're putting out are more focused on individuals and their emotional journeys with their situations influenced by climate change. None of the books focus on technological fixes. Some of them do focus on technologies that are related to climate change or people's responses to climate change, but none of them are fixes. And I think that this is important because I don't want to put books out into the world that give people the impression that this is the solution. I think that the solution is more cultural, and I hope that the books do that they get that across. Like Nico, I'm not a scientist, and I think that, as writers, we do have that responsibility to get messages across because, most of us are not scientists, and most of us are emotional beings, and that's the way that we can reach people, and writing is really important for that. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that.
Uh, I like the one thing that you said earlier when we talked, that we have to reach people where they are, and that's really important when you present just this when there is such complicated science. We can use fiction as a way to reach people where they are with these problems, and that just looking at graphs and data doesn't help. So thank you so much for saying that. Brandon, what about you?
My thought on this, which I think is a phenomenal question, kind of riffs off some of what both Nico and Selena said. When we were looking at the question prep before this, what immediately came to mind for me was a comment that I heard on a panel I was on years ago with another Canadian author, Lex Beckett, who is in Toronto, and they do a fair bit of science fiction and sometimes climate fiction as well. And we were talking about like solar punk and stuff, and they were saying that for writers, like this idea of kind of like what our purpose is and what are the purpose of our art is more so to show show a what if and show a consideration and kind of let that inspire people. Because I feel like this is becoming the disclaimer, but I'm also not a scientist. And so like there's a lot of scientific concepts that I barely understand. But I can still talk about the social aspect and we can still talk about the communal aspect that we've already touched on. And this idea of inspiring change and inspiring thought, kind of like what Selena was saying. And I think so. My approach to that, in terms of like the role of climate fiction, is to be very, very conscious of whether I'm inspiring hope and a desire for change, or the opposite. And this echoes a lot of what Nico said, that like am I, regardless of what I may be thinking or what my mood might be about a particular aspect of the climate crisis, or how optimistic I'm feeling on a given day, do I want to be presenting, that sort of like climate despondency and that hopelessness and that feeling that, that we're screwed, which I generally don't believe, but everyone, I have my days. And, the last thing I want is to be presenting that to people, because I don't want other people to be feeling the same way because of my art. I want my art and the stuff I create to inspire people in the other direction, because that's how we're going to get change. And so I think it's really important to be conscious of that, and what you're putting into your art, and like really think through, okay, like what message are people going to get from this, and how are people going to feel after reading this, and then what might be the effects of that I'm not immediately conscious of, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And I really like when you say that we have to focus more on the hope and not the despondency, because a lot of times when I read apocalyptic or dystopian fiction, what I feel is that the writer is feeling that is hopeless and despondency themselves while they're writing it.
Mhm.
And I just wonder if we can ask ourselves as writers to push past that, like use the art that we're writing to push past that despondency and reach the hope at the end of it, and have that whole journey as part of the craft, as part of the art that we're creating, the
Mhm.
journey through the despondency. Thank you so much, Brandon. Evan. Oh, yeah, Selena.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the despondency. Um, I agree with Brandon entirely that, it's a very bad idea for climate fiction writers to be inspiring despair in people. But I do think that it is important to acknowledge negative emotions, because for a long time, people who were concerned about climate change were called crazy. Like, why are you worried about this? It's not going to happen. It's nothing. It's just normal. This is normal weather patterns. And it's a kind of gaslighting. And for a long time, um, I think that we are starting to internalize that a little bit. And I think it is important for climate fiction to help people to navigate those negative feelings, as well as inspire hope. And
Mhm.
I hope that, like, books that Stelliform puts out, some of them are quite dark, but I do hope that they all have that little bit of hope that helps people to, like, grab that rung on the ladder and pull themselves out of despair if they are there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Matthew Salesses wrote in his Craft in the Real World, where if you have a revolution that ends with a happily ever after, sometimes you suck the activist energy out of people, and maybe you have to leave people wanting to make a change, like leave them angry enough, like activate the despair and anger enough for people to want to do something with it. And sometimes I feel that way when I listen to my favorite climate music, which is really heavy death metal, and that's the best way I've found that depicts the anger and the sorrow of what climate misery is. And it's bleak music, but it helps, just excavate that feeling out of me in the best way possible. So yeah, I see the value of fiction and art like that also,
It's like an
definitely.
exorcism.
Yeah, exactly. Evan, what about you?
So I'm going to hop onto what everyone says, because I'm also not a scientist. I come from more of a like researcher and activist background, and so I also want to add that I believe that using art as a prescriptive blueprint for activism or tackling injustice is kind of a recipe for disaster and a bit dangerous, because well, can art be a useful prism through which to understand the world? I probably say yes. But then if you have to ask art and artists and creatives to take on this responsibility of providing meanings or solutions to all the problems in the world, is to force so much unwarranted responsibility on them, and kind of like assume that they have the solutions to every problem in the world. And also, I can't believe that none of us have the right one size fit all solution to such a huge complex problem that affects like different parts of the world in different ways, and also not just humans, not just them and for person scene as well, but also like trees and like the ecology as well. And it's such a there's so much to think about when it comes to climate fiction and when it comes to climate mitigation, that it's impossible to say that this work that you're writing or making can be a solution to something, because that kind of is also a bit of a form of hubris in a way. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I feel like we need to, leave the science to the scientists, leave the art to the artists, and try not to, in any time you have artists trying to present too many solutions, and this is how we fix everything. We start going down a slippery slope of, well, maybe it'll work for you in the West, but that doesn't translate to somewhere else. And so we need to be really mindful of the differences of how climate change impacts different people in different places in our art also.
Yeah. And I guess like if you're talking about not just art, but also stuff like, Extinction Rebellion, the way they do things, like even for their intentions are good, sometimes there's this like there's also a lot of issues with Extinction Rebellion in the way they kind of like, I don't want to say express those issues, but then the way they exploit other pressing, I guess, issues around the world in order to like to say what they say is kind of a sort of like, I guess it's also food for thought as well, in thinking about how to express pressing issues regarding climate mitigation and climate change in a way that causes less harm to other people as well. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely, because climate change, there's not just the long-term impacts of climate change, we're also dealing with all the immediate racism, the class differences, and war and famine and all that stuff that is more immediate. And if you're trying to exploit those for the climate movement, are you helping? Probably not. All right. Thank you so much for the answer to that question. I want to move on now a little bit to talk about narrative structure in terms of climate change. So we um, are seeing now the fruits of what happens when we have a literary culture focused on certain ways of telling stories, novels, short stories, novellas that are modern, that have been only about 100, 150 years old in their evolution, and coming from a rich history of mythology and fairy tales where we had unnatural events happening one after another. I'm thinking the Arabian Nights, where we just go from one improbable catastrophic event to the next, to now our focus on more intensely personal, character driven, reality focused stories. And I wonder if that is maybe causing us to not be able to look at the whole picture of climate change. But again, we have the answer from Selena that that can help meet people where they are. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what kind of narrative structures, thematic frames, or genres are best suited to show climate change as the fundamental disordering of our reality, and if there are any ways that our current ways not helping, and any genres that you want to see more of. So I wanted to start with Selena on this one.
I love this question because I see it as a chance to talk about something that I feel really strongly about, and that is climate fiction that is not rooted in the technological narrative. Stories that are within the genre that we've become accustomed to through writers like Kim Stanley Robinson, who are offering those technological solutions. So Stelliform has published fantasy and horror dealing with climate change, and I think that there are some serious strengths in these genres for climate fiction. For example, fantasy is often drawing from fairy tale structures or tropes, and these are really connected to an ancient way of living alongside nature, in nature, immersed in nature in a way that we just aren't, most of us these days. And then horror, of course, is providing a space for us to explore our fear, our despair, in a safe way. And I think that on top of using those genres and really going back to the root of those genres in climate fiction, structural play is really important and interesting. I'll just talk a little bit about a book that is coming out from Stellaform this year. I've got it right here. It has a lovely cover right here. It's called The House of Drought by Dennis Mombauer. And it is doing really interesting structural things. So first of all, there's a frame where the story is told from this external frame where two characters are producing a documentary in Sri Lanka. And they are foreigners who have come to the country. And so you're getting, first of all, their perspective. And, you know, it's not a, you're not supposed to like them, you could say. You're supposed to become aware of their roles as foreigners exploiting people in that country. And so we have this structural frame, and then inside that frame, there is this haunted house narrative that is very twisty. And sometimes you get the end of the story first, or you get the middle first. And the structure itself is very much like the house that the story is about. So yeah, I really enjoy structural play because it can give a sense of the disorientation that we're experiencing with climate change, and how the systems that we're used to are becoming weird, right? They're becoming, for example, just the weather is very strange this year, and people are commenting on it all around me. And so I love it when books and authors are picking up on that and making that a part of their narrative structure.
Mhm.
Yeah, so looking at the structures of stories we're telling is increasingly important because, you know, it's the structures that are creating this problem. And so if we can use structure to criticize structure, I think that's really cool.
That sounds so cool. And I'm so glad that Stellarform are doing such phenomenal work in this field. And I can't wait to read every book that comes out this year. Brandon, what about you?
Yes, 100% agreement with Selena on all of that. And I think particularly in terms of genre, 'cause I find that that's where my mind goes most often when it comes to climate fiction. And one to talk about Stellaform again, After the Dragons, I thought did this absolutely amazingly. And if you haven't read that from Stellaform, please go read it because it is a fabulous story that I think that comes at it comes to climate fiction from the again more the social aspect, incorporates dragons and mythology and stuff in a way that I think is incredibly moving that through that entire story. Because I think like kind of echoing a lot of what Selena said, you know, there's a lot of power I think in all different types of fantasy stories to explore you know elements of climate crisis and elements of solar punk and the solar punk side of it is tough because I think solar punk is still in a process of kind of defining what it is. But I see elements of solar punk in a lot of different fantasy stories, and I think there's a lot of spots where you can inject it subtly into, say, a secondary world fantasy, or overtly, like there's in terms of the climate side of the more overt fantasy is like Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, right, which is very obviously climate fiction, but is also very obviously fantasy, and or can be considered such, and so I think like I see the reason why this come to mind all the time for me is I see a lot of people saying, oh well, you know, like real climate fiction or valuable climate fiction is mostly science fiction, and I'm like, come on, man, like you know, like you're missing a huge piece of it. What I try to do in a lot of my work and tried to do in the novel that I have coming out later this year is to just embed elements of sustainability and renewables and like environmental thought and environmentalism and you know more harmony with nature, just kind of embed that sort of stuff almost in the background of your world, make it a natural part of the world, in a way that like the characters in the world don't bat an eye at because it's what they know, and hopefully in a way that the reader will be going through and be like, oh, this this is a fantasy novel that has, where the world has universal basic income, or this is a fantasy world where, there's wind towers in the background, or et cetera, et cetera. And I think that kind of to go back to one of the points that was made at the start of this panel about kind of inspiring that and reminding people and showing it to people in a way that maybe they're not expecting, I think is a really, really useful tool as a writer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes complete sense where, the story is not about this topic, but it's there, and
Exactly.
it's just around it so much that it just feels like you have to reckon with it in every story element and not just as the
Mhm.
main topic. Really, really critical. Evan, what about you? Hi, I think you're muted, sorry.
So yeah, I guess my cop-out answer would be that any genre or narrative frame can be an excellent structure with which to write climate stories, because we need as many ways of writing about climate change as there are issues and concerns regarding climate change around the world. And like for example, teaching children about ecology and showing the next generation like more possibilities and potentials of what can be done to care more about the environment and about the ecology might require a different structure and genre from, like, I suppose, going for the juggler and condemning governmental apathy towards like climate mitigation with, I guess, a slow punk story or a post-apocalyptic story like The Road by Cormac McCarthy, or an eco horror story like Annihilation and the Rise of the Southern Reach trilogy, and or something completely different like this book I've recently read called Notes from a Burning Age by Claire North. And but I do think that science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction as a whole have a advantage over more realist genres, because like there's more room to play and to experiment, and like as Selena said, like to have like push the boundaries when it comes to like structural form, and kind of use that as a scaffolding with distribute a story to critique like um climate change issues as a whole. And so yeah.
Yeah, like I'm thinking that just the tradition of Western narratives where you have three acts and everything's escalating, how does that help us write climate fiction, and does it? And whether there is something about that structure that is just limiting us to what we are able to write, and maybe other structures using structure to disorient readers in the same way like what Selena was saying, uh, that climate change really does to us, is really something worth exploring in our art, and I'm really excited to see what people come up with. Nico, what about you?
Yeah, everyone has really smart thoughts. I'm not sure about best. I think I agree with Owen that you can, if you do it well, then you've done it well. Something that I like a lot, and something that I imbibe a lot of from nonfiction, is kind of, I guess, like episodic reportage, I suppose. Like a long reads type of thing, deep journalism. I, as a third world person, I hate ethnography as like a thing, but ethnography is basically so that kind of episodic interview structure, a deep dive into a particular community, um, and a historical dive into a community plus what's happening now. I think that episodic structure works so well in, for example, of course, Le Guin's Hainish stories, and is it Never Coming Home that, or is it The Telling? Maybe it's The Telling. She did a lot of good work. I want to say it's The Telling is an ethnographer. But yeah, so that kind of thing. Malka Older does great work with this as well in a couple different short stories, I believe. But yeah, that's something that I think is a great crossover structural possibility for change fiction, because personally for me, it's had such an effect on me as a nonfiction reader about these issues.
Mm-hmm. And that actually like leads me right into the next topic that I want to discuss, which is the types of climate stories that we want to see. And now I want to see an anthology TV series produced by HBO about the ethnography of either climate cause people or people's activists working in climate change. And I also want to see the Captain Planet show rebooted, where Captain Planet is actively dealing with the politicians and oil executives causing delay in climate policies. I want to see a Climate Corps Mad Men show that really talks about the interpersonal drama between climate corps people. And there's so much that, so many different kinds of climate stories that I want to see. So I want to know from you guys, what are you craving? What climate stories are you craving that you're not seeing enough of right now? And Nico, please continue.
Yeah, this Captain Planet thing is gonna obsess me now, because I have to like figure out who gets to be Captain Planet. Um, so something, yeah. When you first asked this, my first thought was in terms of generational issues. So to back up a little bit, one of a novel project that I've had on the back burner for a while started off mainly as a Mars story, because I'm obsessed with Mars. I'm a nerd. But it's one of the things that led me to become more invested in this topic as a writer and as like a human being. Because when I found a reason for these people to be on Mars, it was because the carrying capacity of Earth was greatly decreased. They needed to find out the carrying capacity of Mars. And so this was maybe 10 years ago. I started plotting out just a rough timeline of when particular projected events would happen. So I looked at the science as much as I could, and I made myself a little timeline. And I don't know if other writers have this, but this is the book for me that I kind of look at, put back in the trunk, and look at and put back in the trunk like once every year or two. And so, yeah. And so what I found with this was that every time I took it out again, I would have to adjust the timeline. Not always because of new science, but because of actual events. This or that, you know, part of the ice shelf had actually already fallen, or, this or that amount of the Greenland ice has in fact been lost. And so I would find myself adjusting this timeline by massive amounts. And has become, it's a very sobering thing to look at over the years. And it's become for me this thing where I realize, as we look at near future and middle future stories, these aren't about, people we've never met. These are about us, and these are about young people that we know, and these are about, my 10-year-old niece and what her adulthood will look like. And so for me, what I would love is stories that deal specifically with, I suppose, the way that our different access to a world before we had to grapple with this changes how we grapple with this. So how my niece's climate reality will differ from mine, simply because I was able to be 10 years old and not think about this. So yeah, Gen Z climate change, I guess.
No, it's that's so critical. Like just seeing how different generations are dealing with the same issue, and just how it changes, it's getting more severe, and how it impacts the youngest amongst us. I think that is definitely underexplored and something that has rich vein for art. Selena, what about you?
Just to add to what Nico was saying, the generations have such a different experience of climate change, and I think that race and class come into it as well. But affluent people in the West have this idea of progress, and we should be working towards something. And if we're not working towards something, then we're failing. And I think that that influences a lot of climate narratives. And I would definitely like to see something outside of that. And I think that we can find narratives outside of that with Gen Z because they have grown up sort of outside of this idea of progress. Or they are growing up currently outside of this idea of progress, or at least critical of it. And I realized when I was writing notes for this question, I had just seen a short story collection that I really wanted to read called Out There by Kate Folk. And people are talking about it as an internet gothic collection. And I was like, oh, I wonder if there's anything to do with climate change and like how does internet culture deal with climate change? And I would really like to see something like that for sure. Um, I mean, apart from that, there's just not a lot of YA with regards to climate change. There's more coming, and Stellaform has some coming in November from Sim Kern, which we're really excited about. But I definitely like to see more climate fiction YA, and more specifically from Gen Z and their interesting, like, post-ironic style. I think that would be really cool.
The internet gothic climate change, that just sounds, it hits all my buttons at the same time. It's crazy. Brandon, what about you?
Yeah, the idea of Gen Z climate fiction sounds absolutely amazing to me because I'm a high school teacher by day, and so I get to see kind of what my students think about stuff, and we talk about that in class about like in all sorts of respects, like they've never seen a world without X, Y, and Z, and how that changes their outlook versus my outlook, and so I would absolutely love that. Um, One of the things that I find I'm not seeing enough of, and it could just be that I haven't come across it, and I hope it's out there and someone can be like, "Oh, go read this," are books, and I'm going to focus still on fantasy, but books or series where um, industrialization and the way that our society went historically with the Industrial Revolution and all the you know pollution and social issues and so forth with that is not necessarily presented as inevitable. Like what I wrote a article about this a while back and focused on Joe Abercrombie's I think it's The Age of Madness is his most recent trilogy and kind of the first law books. And as much as I love those books, when I was reading the first one in that trilogy, he kind of moves the world ahead by it's like 20 years or some such, and goes from a kind of almost like stereotypical Eurocentric inspired fantasy world to still a almost stereotypical Eurocentric inspired fantasy world where they've gone through their own industrial revolution, and you see all the kind of inherent changes with that, and I remember reading it and thinking to myself, okay, well, that sort of path does not need to be inevitable, and it kind of ties into I think what Selena was saying about progress. This idea that there are certain benchmarks that a society is going to hit, and it involves fossil fuels, it involves this, it involves assembly lines and so forth. And I think by all the time presenting that in the second world fantasy worlds as this is logically what's going to happen, I think that like painting that as inevitable, I think implicitly like contributes to this idea that oil will always be part of how we do things, and fossil fuels and combustion engine stuff will always be part of how we do things, and like carbon capture will solve everything and we'll still drive our cars exactly what we want. I think it all feeds into that sort of that narrative that we're stuck in, and I would love to see more authors breaking from that sort of inevitability, and like maybe your world doesn't use fossil fuels either because it doesn't have it, or maybe people in your world that you're writing look at that, they see these fossil fuels and whatever it is, and look at it and realize the issues it's going to cause, and think to themselves, maybe we won't, let's just leave that where it is and we're going to go somewhere else and do something else, because that could be inspiring as well, I think. So I would love to see more of that somewhere.
Awesome. Evan, what about you? We have a minute, sorry.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with all of the above, especially when it comes to like stories that explore generational difference in terms of worldview and lived experience, because like our own lived experience is definitely radically different from, I guess, Gen Z's lived experience of climate change, and also our previous generation as well, like our parents, our grandparents, and the way they see the world is so different from how we see the world, and we see what's going to happen in the future as well. Because like for like to take an example, like my parents don't even believe that, I won't even believe that climate change is a thing, but they don't see the urgency in it. While we, as someone who is caught between like Gen Z and the previous generation, has the experience of like seeing the impact of climate change on the world, but also knowing that the future is going to be so much worse and that Gen Z is going to have it so much worse. And so I agree with wanting to see more of what Gen Z has to say about it, and kind of also in a way that kind of weaves experiences of different generations into their own stories as well. And I'm really excited to see that. And another thing I also really want to see is more of a like localized um way of like localized stories of climate change that tackles issues that are specific to certain regions that are outside of the West. For example, like in Hong Kong right now, one of the most pressing climate change issue is like the issue of land reclamation, and also like the spreading of artificial islands, and also like how the coast is kind of like severely polluted because of this need to build more land and more islands outside of the main island itself. And also like in different parts of the world, like Sri Lanka, and also like also kind of like not just in like East or Southeast Asia as well. Like those kind of stories, those are stories I want to know about and to see more of, because it's not just like a yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I want so many more of those stories, and I find them more in short stories somehow. Like for example, like Reckoning, like they put out so many good stories from around the world that deal with issues in different ways that I really love reading about. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Evan. That Reckoning, I was hoping somebody would mention. It's such a great short fiction magazine that is full of climate fiction every month. We're over time, so I just wanted to skip over our questions that you guys were so hard to answer, and go straight to like, what are you guys most excited about coming out next from you, and where can where can the attendees find you on social media? And I can start with Brandon.
All right. Oh man, we can go. Why can't we go for another hour?
I know.
But yeah, so I'm Brandon Crilly. I'm mostly active on Twitter. I'll drop the link in Discord. And I'll drop the link to my newsletter as well. I've got my debut fantasy novel coming out in the fall, which has a lot of the kind of climate fiction, solar punky sort of stuff embedded in it, like I was talking about. And actually, tomorrow night, something that has nothing intrinsically to do with climate fiction. I do a Twitch stream with other authors every month called Bag of Giving, where we play tabletop role-playing games, just do one-shots and spotlight charities and do giveaways and stuff. And so we're playing a Star Trek Adventures game tomorrow with myself and Darcy Little Badger, Alex White, Premi Mohammed, Mike Chen, and Nathan Burgoyne are going to get together and just geek out and play Star Trek, and spotlight some charities. Yeah, I'll drop a link for that in the chat as well.
Awesome. Evan?
So yeah, I'm Evan Ma, and I'm mostly on I'm on Twitter at Awanigma. I'll drop it in the Discord. And right now I'm about to go on query with a noveling thing manuscript about I'm actually revising it right now, It takes place in a city poisoned by radiation and a electronic waste landfill, but the three protagonists of the story are able to create a parallel world from within that setting. So it's part dystopian and about climate change and part horror fantasy. And so yeah, that's currently what I'm working on right now, and I'm excited to finally go on some of it because I've been working on it for like several years and I'm kind of really tired with it. So yeah.
Awesome. Good luck to you, Evan. I will join you in the query trenches. Nico.
Thank you everybody so much. I'm on Twitter at Nicasio Reed. I'm at nicasio.reed.com. I actually have a story out right now on the current issue of Reckoning called Babang Luksa, which takes place in the near future flooded Philadelphia with a Filipino-Italian family. I haven't yet found like a cool way to say that I'm Filipino from Philadelphia, but if you think of one, like it just kind of molds it to each other. Anyway, thank you guys so much. That's it. That's me. Bye.
Awesome. Selena.
Thank you so much, everybody. This has been really great. Stellaform is on Twitter at Stellaform Press, also on Instagram and Facebook at Stellaform Press. We have an amazing cover reveal coming up for Weird Fishes. I mean, I think our covers are pretty good, but this one's going to blow your mind. So follow us and you'll see it. It's great. Thank you.
Awesome. And I'm Sid. I have a climate fiction story coming out in the anthology Phase Changes next month. It's about a scientist's journey to create a microbe that can suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and what the scientist learns from the microbe and what the microbe learns from the scientist in that journey. And I'm querying right now with a climate espionage thriller. So hopefully somebody will get to see that soon also. Thank you so much to the panelists. Sorry for going 6 minutes over. Thank you so much, audience. Sorry I couldn't get to your question also, but we will be in the Toast Discord channel if you have any questions. And hope you're having a great Flights of Foundry. Bye.